So, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood. It comes touted as the Mister Rogers movie. It's based on an article that Esquire did about Mr. Fred Rogers in the late 1990s by Esquire magazine, and this film sort of kind of like dramatizes how does Fred Rogers approach to maybe like to like a cynical journalist play into like how does Fred Rogers' philosophy work for adults? And it's interesting that the way this film is staged, because this film is clearly aimed at at a lot of like adults and people who grew up watching Mister Rogers, because it starts off in a similar way. It begins with Tom Hanks playing Fred Rogers. I mean, he's perfectly suited for this role. Does he have? I mean, he has a little bit of the look, maybe not. He has the same cadence, maybe not the right voice, but it's fine. The main thing is that he brings off that air of Fred Rogers that we used to love. He comes onto the screen in the same way that we used to watch Fred Rogers come onto our television sets, every day, and he just comes out there and just greets us the same way. And he starts off, the way he would start off any episode. And it quickly dawns on me, like, I mean, for one, yeah, it's amazing to watch Tom Hanks play Fred Rogers, but it quickly dawns on you that this whole film is kind of staged like a Mister Rogers Neighborhood episode for adults, because it tackles this story of a cynical journalist, who in this case is called Lloyd Vogel, who's played by Matthew Rhys. And they establish this film is not afraid to address, like real adult issues, similar to the way that Fred Rogers was never afraid. Like if you've ever, watched like a lot of the, if you watch like last year's documentary on him, that his show covered stuff like death and assassination and war and very, very tough subjects to deal with in the adult world. But his program had this kind of like fearlessness to it, where it felt like Fred could talk with us about anything. And so, and in that same sense, this film is not afraid to talk about, the problems that, that we carry with us as adults. Like they established that Lloyd is this journalist who, he doesn't feel like he's valued at his job. Like he feels like, he's just doing puff pieces, that he's not quite writing what he wants to write about. He has a very troubling relationship with his dad. Like he cannot forgive him for what his dad did to his mother. His father is played by Chris Cooper, who embodies this great sense of both, of both pain and anger for his past, which is perfect. I mean, it's Chris Cooper. He usually does a pretty good job. So, and also, Lloyd also is a new father. He now has a little baby, and his wife is played by Susan Watson. And he's finding himself kind of like distant from his home life. Not quite sure if he can be quite the dad that he wants to be, because he's afraid of his own past. And then he gets handed this assignment for Fred Rogers, and just thinks, okay, it's Mister Rogers, whatever. It's a children's entertainer. But then he's astounded that he actually gets a phone call from him, and then he says, probably like the words you would never expect to hear from someone you're interviewing, which is, the most important thing in the world to me right now is that I'm talking to you. And he has like this devotion to anyone who comes into his life. And it's interesting because like when Lloyd actually goes to interview Mr. Rogers, or sorry, Fred Rogers, he's astounded to find out that, on his show, Fred is just Fred. Like, it always feels like he makes time for everyone. And I love how it kind of, like, annoys his staff. Like he'd be, like, shooting a segment, but then when Lloyd would show up, he'd drop everything and then just go over and say, like, it's my friend Lloyd. And when he actually starts interviewing, when Lloyd actually starts interviewing Fred Rogers, it's interesting because Fred actually takes more interest in asking Lloyd questions about himself. Because at that moment he cares for him, because he sees that he's got a little scar on his nose, and he's like, well, where did that scar come from? He's like, well, I got into a fight. It's like, oh no, who'd you get into a fight with? And all of a sudden the interview is not about Fred anymore, but it's about Lloyd. And it's interesting the way that Fred refers to himself. Like Lloyd tries to get some stuff out of him. Like, do you consider yourself a hero? Because it's an article for about heroes. It's like, I don't think I'm a hero. And they clearly, and then he later interviews Mr. Rogers' wife, and realizes that he doesn't think of him. He thinks of himself as humble, and that he wants to do the best thing for everyone. Everyone that he meets and everyone in this world. He wants to bring out the best potential in everyone, and he wants people to believe that that anyone can be like Mr. Rogers, that anyone could have this sense of kindness to them, that they can approach the world, that they can show love, that they can show forgiveness. And it would seem like this type of film, like it really could have bordered on melodrama, especially since it goes into a little bit of some surreal places for like some of the visuals, because like I said, they kind of merge this to be like an episode of Mr. Rogers. So there's some interesting transition sequences. Like anyone who remembers like Picture from the show, they actually use them as like a transition at one point. Say like, let's see how magazines are made, and that'll transition over into Esquire, and then we'll get like a little bit of Speedy Delivery. We'll see a little bit of the land of make believe and some of the familiar puppets and stuff like that, and help us better understand how to how to forgive people and how to understand people. Which is great, because like the way that like the film starts off too, is like Fred kind of introduced like, this is my friend Lloyd, and so like Lloyd had a little bit of a fight, and it seems like that could be a dark setup, but then Fred just kind of like gives us this very honest take about talking about our emotions and forgiveness. Now throughout this film, I'm sure for a lot of people who grew up with Mr. Rogers, you're gonna be on the verge of tears. Like just about every scene with Hanks in this film playing Mr. Rogers, I was on the verge of tears. But it was mainly because of, and it's not for anything like super melodramatic. It's just for the fact that he embodied kind of the person that that we've always seen as Mr. Rogers. Like anytime I would watch like some of like the heavier stuff in his program, or listen to him in interviews and stuff like that, I would get a little misty-eyed, because and a lot of people might be asking like, well why why am I crying so much at this? And I think it's because to realize that someone out there likes you just the way you are, not because of any worth that you have to prove anything, but just liking you for who you are, and for how rare that sounds to have in our world, that it's so overwhelmingly kind of like touching and wholesome that it really gets to you. Like I've no joke, I was borderline crying like throughout this film, and it's interesting because a lot of the time they focus on Lloyd as this person who wants to reject this ideal of Mr. Rogers. Like he doesn't believe that Fred is the same person on the television set as he is in real life. And it's hard for him to realize that, to realize that someone could be like this. And it's interesting that how Lloyd tries to find the darker side of Mr. Rogers. Like he tries to talk about stuff in his life that might be hard, or elements of his life that make him angry, or when he doesn't seem like he's at his best. And for a lot of people who have like seen like that documentary and heard other interviews with Fred Rogers, people who knew Fred Rogers, it seemed like he would conceal a little bit of he would conceal that anger, or he'd try to transfer it into something. And it's amazing how he would do it in every scene here. Like there's a scene where Lloyd says, it must be hard for your for your kids to grow up with someone like Mr. Rogers in the house. And to care to so much about people, that must be a huge burden on you. And that would kind of seem insulting to Fred, because that always seems to be like his MO is that he always cares about people. But he just kind of puts it in perspective and says like, it helps that I have that clarity, so thank you for bringing that into my life. And yeah, there's a lot of like nostalgic stings here that I think really work well. In particular, one of the most powerful scenes in the film, I think, is there's a scene where Fred takes Lloyd out to lunch, and while they're having lunch, Fred says he wants to do an exercise with him, and he's done this at an award ceremony too, and it's deeply moving, and it's just as moving in this film, where he says, I want to have a moment of silence, and in this silence, we're going to think about all the people who willed us into this world and who loved us. And for that one moment, the film kind of like snaps out of its groove for a moment, because everyone in the restaurant is quiet. Both Lloyd and Fred are quiet. Everyone around him is quiet. They're contemplative. Some have their eyes closed. And there's this great moment where the camera just comes close to Fred. And he's initially looking at Lloyd. And then he's looking at us. And you can tell, and you can see that look in Hanks's eyes, like, almost like he can see that, we're having these happy thoughts, and trying to have that sense of empathy. And it's surprising, just have that one moment there, that moment of meditation on the world, and to bring a little bit of clarity, and to give us a break from the world, and that scene is very effective. It would seem like like a fairly easy scene, touching on all like the little beats of Mr. Rogers. They actually glaze through quite a bit of the familiar beats of Mr. Rogers throughout this film. That I'm glad that they kind of held on those more important ones, that I think are really touching here. This is this is a pretty moving picture, and I love how it kind of creates almost a sort of like aloofness to how Mr. Rogers might deeply feel. Like we almost kind of like feel like Lloyd, because we want to pierce down, we want to get to know more about Mr. Rogers. But the thing is, like, it seems like he doesn't want to to idolize himself or give too much of himself away. Because it's mainly because he wants to give so much back to us, and he wants to give so much back to the world through him. Hanks's performance is just, it's astounding. I mean, there's nobody better you could get to play Tom Hanks. In fact, right before this film started, this film played on National Kindness Day, and there was a little introduction there by Fred Rogers' wife. And she talked about how we could really use a movie like this in this day and age, and that if Fred were alive today, he would have loved to have seen Tom Hanks play him on the screen. And this is a film that I think is very worthy of the way that that Fred Rogers, how his legacy is such a huge contribution both to like television and education. And I love the fact that they kind of scaled him up, like they kind of like scale up the Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood into this kind of like somewhat like surreal transitions of making his show work for an adult audience. And that's the thing, is because like Fred was always honest, and I know like a lot of people are gonna point out, yeah, he did actually do a show for adults once a long time ago, and he actually he quit like doing Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood for a while and did some adult shows, and then came back to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. But of course, most people remember Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and I think it helps to remind us to remind ourselves, with this film, and maybe if you want to like go back and watch some of those episodes, is to realize how important those lessons are, and how Fred's philosophy carried on from not just establishing the self-esteem of children, to build them up into adults, to make them feel comfortable with the world, but also to make us feel comfortable with ourselves. And it can be tough to do that, to open up and be true with our feelings, and I love that aspect of Mr. Rogers is so heavily focused here that, like I said, I was on the verge of tears. I'm literally on the verge of tears right now, just thinking about so many of these great moments within the film. So yeah. So before I burst out into tears here, I'll just say yes, it's a beautiful, wonderful film, and Tom Hanks is absolutely perfect in this film. So, A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, 4.5 out of 5 stars.